So for our first presentation, we're extremely honored to have actually the first director of the Duluth lab, Don Mount, here to sort of kick things off. And in addition to being the first director at the lab there, Don was a founding member of CTAC, so we've got a kind of a double historic moment here. And so to start, I'd like to welcome Don back to his first CTAC meeting, about 15 years. And invite him up.
Get you started here, right? There.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Gary. I want to offer an apology before I begin, and that is that, you know, when children are very young, you have to be careful with them and take care of them, and I'll let you know that when you get to my age, you have to do the same thing. So if my memory gives out during this presentation, you'll know what the problem is. I thought that I would spend my few minutes, rather than talking about the laboratory per se, because so many of you in the audience were not even born when the laboratory started, and more importantly, you don't have a memory of what conditions were like in this country of the surface waters, and I'm not aware of any publication that would tell you that. So I thought what I would do is kind of talk about the context in which that laboratory was started, and people following me will tell you what's going on there and what went on there. And also, the last time I gave a talk, I used 35 millimeter slides, so if I don't use this thing right, you'll know what the problem is. You know, that thing isn't moving. What did I do wrong?
What did you do wrong?
This one went up.
Yeah.
Well, that's not even the one that's up there now. Yeah, let me get out of the room.
Yeah. And Josh, are you? This thing is, the page down thing is not doing what it's supposed to be doing.
The arrow keys or clicking the mouse tends to work. So
Yeah.
it's all in there.
Yeah.
There you go. So you just have to use this up and down arrow on
Okay.
the keyboard here.
Oh, okay.
So
I was told to do this one.
Well, the arrow keys sometimes.
Okay.
Work.
Okay. Now let's see if it works. Now, the time I want to talk about, by the way, if I get away from this microphone, somebody stick their hand up and I'll get close to it again. I want to talk a little bit about the situation in this country after the Second World War and up to the time of Earth Day and really beyond to the Clean Water Act of 1972. Because if you weren't around then or aware of what things were like, it was really different. The conditions, there were essentially no standards at that time, and that picture of a hand there is a hand that was stuck in that harbor, and it's oil. There were no treatment, very little treatment of either industry or even municipalities. It was just discharged raw, and of course, starting in. See, slides are easier; you can handle them. And there were no air pollution laws at that time, and there were no solid waste laws, and water pollution didn't involve aquatic life to speak of. It was just drinking water. That's the only thing that there was really much concern about. And then there were so many fish kills that there was a laboratory in Cincinnati to put out that annual report of the fish kills, and there were no methods for deciding what caused it. And one thing I didn't say was that following the Second World War, maybe there's a slide coming up for that, there was just an explosion of chemical use that did not occur during the war or before the World War. And maybe I should let you know where I fit in this history. I started college in 1949, and I finished a PhD in 1960. So I kind of lived in college through the growth period that occurred in trying to improve the nation's waters. And I was hired by the Public Health Service at that time because water pollution was in the Public Health Service. There was no EPA then. And I was hired to develop autopsy methods because, as I just mentioned, in the fish kills, you could go out there and see them, but that's all you could do. I mean, you couldn't figure out what was causing it because there were hundreds and hundreds of toxic chemicals in the waters if it was an area where there were lots of discharges. And so Dr. Clarence Tarswell had a small group at the Taft Center in Cincinnati. And by the way, I should mention that laboratory was essentially the only laboratory in the world of any size that did water pollution work. And most of what they did was drinking water and waste treatment. But Tarswell had a small group of 4 biologists. Maybe there were 6 if we count a couple of supervisors. And that was a group I was hired into, and I was asked to develop methods to determine why fish were dying. When I went to the Taft Center in Cincinnati to start work in the fall of 1960, the Ohio River had very few fish in it. It was heavily polluted, and there was a Kanawha River up in West Virginia that flowed into the Ohio River, and it did not have anything in it that was live except bacteria. Well, and occasionally there was a little algae in it, but it was just a line, a 20-mile line of chemical plants that were discharging without treatment. And I think I already said that there was no required treatment. So a discharger could dump anything they wanted to, most anywhere, and dilution was not even considered in those days. What I wanted to point out with this was that there was that steel strike in the first winter I was in Cincinnati, and the river was running kind of red in color from the steel mill waste dumped in. A lot of it was up at Pittsburgh. A lot of you probably aren't familiar with the Ohio River, but it starts when 2 rivers come together at Pittsburgh, and then it flows down through the south part of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, into the Mississippi River. And Cincinnati took their drinking water from the Ohio River, and there was beginning to be growing concern about whether the treatment for water supply that was going on there was really adequate. But what I wanted to point out was that while that first winter I was in Cincinnati, there was a nationwide steel strike. And that river turned from red to green because there was a big algae bloom. The heavy metal concentrations went down in the Ohio River, and so algae could grow. And the Cuyahoga River, you probably have seen that story somewhere. It caught fire several times because there was so much oil floating on the surface. I was on that river, I think it was in about '69, and there were lots of bays where you could not see the surface of the water. It was just oil. And so that was kind of the story of surface waters that occurred. And then I wanted to mention this explosion of chemicals because through the Second World War, up to that time, there was not a lot of chemicals. Well, there were a lot of chemicals produced, but nothing compared to what it's like now. And I think that the concern about these chemicals, which were beginning to cause fish kills and stuff, began to be recognized. And about this same time, was well, you know, DDT was developed during the Second World War, and I remember reading articles in the paper at that time, and they said that when the World War is over and they can use DDT for fly control, there won't be any houseflies anymore. And I remember when I lived in Columbus, Ohio, while I was in graduate school, I lived out in a small urban neighborhood, and once a week there was a Jeep that came down the alley spraying DDT to kill the mosquitoes along the garbage cans and stuff, and flies too. And once a week they came down. And another story about the DDT is that in Milwaukee, this was in the 60s, the Dutch elm disease had arrived in Milwaukee and was killing all the elm trees, which they had lots and lots of in the city. And they were putting 4 pounds of DDT on each tree. And of course, a lot of those trees were growing out of a crack in the concrete or a space between the sidewalk and the street. And so the DDT was falling on asphalt and concrete and was running right off into Lake Michigan. And that's what produced the problem with the lake trout dying out, because it accumulated in the eggs.
What if I put handcuffs on you?
Okay.
You want to be on that one?
What backup one? Okay. And that was kind of the beginning of the concern over water pollution, I think, where chemicals like that. And as Dave has shown you here, Silent Spring came out in the I think it was in the early 60s, I believe, 62. And I'll talk about that later, but that brought a lot of public attention to the pesticide problem, and pesticides at that time, the regulation or the registration of pesticides was done in the Department of Agriculture, not in Public Health Service, or it wasn't EPA then. And so they really were only concerned about drinking water concerns. And there was hardly any aquatic testing done at all in the registration process at that time. Congressman Blatnick was the local congressman from the area where the Duluth lab is, and he was a major voice among politicians and the federal government about water pollution concerns, and he was the one that developed or funded the building of the Duluth lab. And the difficulty at that time with the federal law was that the federal government had no jurisdiction over waters other than interstate waters. And even then, in order to go into enforcement action, you had to do two things. You had to show that the pollutant was discharged in one state and that it flowed into another state and caused damage. And if you couldn't show those two things, then the federal government didn't have authority over doing anything about it. And at that time, there was no court action at all. It was done by what were called enforcement conferences, which were kind of, it was a gathering of the states involved in the basin, and they would talk about what the problem was and what they could do about it. And it was essentially voluntary. I mean, there was no penalty if they didn't follow what they said they would do. And so that was the thing that the public didn't get much response from, because there weren't all that many enforcement conferences done. And the jurisdiction, in 65, which is the important part there, Congressman Blatnick got into the federal legislation a requirement that the states had to set water quality standards. And that was kind of what caused Duluth to do what it did. The Duluth lab was dedicated in 1967, And it was assigned the responsibility to develop data so that water quality standards could be promulgated. And at that time, I remember when I started in Cincinnati in 1960, I don't think there was a single chronic fish test for a chemical in existence. Everything was just 96 hours or 48 hours or something like that. And so I spent a lot of my time in Newtown, which was near Cincinnati, trying to develop methods. And also, flow-through methods were not available yet then. And so when you were working with chemicals like DDT, for example, which had an LC50 in the range of a part per billion or less, microgram per liter, and it was the DDT would diffuse into fat because it was so not soluble in water that if you had a static test, the fish would soak up all the DDT that was in there. If you had 10 liters, there'd only be 10 micrograms in there, and that could easily go into the fat of the fish, and so they weren't even exposed to anything in a static test. And so that was another assignment I had. It was to work on, I'm sorry, I wasn't watching this. So anyway, that was kind of the situation that the Duluth lab was developed in, and was assigned that responsibility of developing data for water quality standards. My arrow is not working now. Thank you for getting up. So the Duluth lab was dedicated in 1972, and it was assigned that responsibility of developing data for water quality standards. And the people that are going to follow me in talking will tell you about what it does now, because the mission has been widely increased over what it was then. I should have brought my 35 millimeter projector along. Yeah, that's a picture of the laboratory today. It was expanded a little bit over what was built in 1967, and it sits on the shore of Lake Superior.
Okay, because of, is this on? Can you hear this? All right. Well, because of the technological glitches, we're starting to slip a little bit, and we're well into the transition time, so if you have to get up, and go, by all means. But I think probably to get back on track, if we could, Russ, if you want to come on up and get ready to go here.